Before there were temples made of stone, there were names spoken into the wind, before scripture, before doctrine, before the faiths we recognize today. There were gods whose names filled the mouths of millions. Gods who commanded sacrifice. Gods who explained the thunder. Gods who held the rain in their hands and decided who would eat and who would starve. They were not myths to the people who prayed to them. They were the architecture of reality itself that a farmer in ancient Sumer did not plant his barley and hope for the best. He planted it and prayed to Enlil, Lord of the air, who could bless his crop or bury it beneath storm and flood. A sailor crossing the Pacific did not simply trust the currents. He called upon Tangaroa, who was the ocean, who could cradle his canoe or swallow a whole. These gods were not fantasy. They were survival, and then they disappeared, not in war, not in some cosmic battle. They simply faded. Their temples crumbled. Their priests grew old and died without successors. Their names were forgotten, or reduced to footnotes, or absorbed into the names of other gods in other languages. This is not a story about Fossett. This is a story about time, because every god, no matter how powerful, how beloved, how central to the lives of those who worship them, every god exists at the mercy of memory. And memory is fragile. What follows is a record of the divine that time nearly erased. Not to mock them, not to judge the people who believed, but to remember that once these names were everything. Gods do not die the way mortals do. They do not grow old. They do not fall ill. They do not lie down in beds and cease to breathe. But they do disappear. It happens slowly. A generation stops teaching the old prayers. A conqueror comes and brings new gods, and the old ones are quietly set aside. A language dies, and with it, the hymns. A temple falls into ruin, and no one rebuilds it. Sometimes it is violent. The rise of Christianity saw the destruction of countless pagan shrines. The spread of Islam reshaped the religious landscape of entire continents. Empires do not only conquer land, they conquer belief, but more often, it is gentle. A merging, a renaming. The old god becomes a saint. The old ritual becomes a festival. The old shrine becomes a church built on the same sacred ground, facing the same sacred direction. The god does not vanish all at once. First, the god loses power. Then, the god loses followers. Then, the god loses a name. And finally, the god becomes a story people tell about what others used to believe. This is the progression, from worship to memory to myth to silence. Languages play their part. When Sumerian stopped being spoken, the gods of Sumer became difficult to access. Their hymns could no longer be sung with understanding. Their prayers became archaeological artifacts, translated by scholars thousands of years later, stripped of rhythm and feeling. Some gods survive in fragments. A name in a text. A carving on a broken stone. A reference in the writings of a Greek traveler who barely understood what he was seeing. Some gods are replaced by similar gods with different names. The storm god of one culture becomes the storm god of the next. But the names change, and after enough generations, people forget there was ever a difference, and some gods simply stop making sense. When people no longer live by the rhythms of planting and harvest, the gods of grain lose their urgency. When people no longer navigate by stars and currents, the gods of the sea become decorative. When lightning is understood as electricity, the gods of thunder become metaphors. The world changes, and the gods that cannot change with it are left behind. But they were real once. Real in the only way that matters. They shaped lives. They gave meaning to suffering. They offered hope in the face of chaos. They explained the inexplicable. To forget them entirely is to forget what it meant to be human in those times. To forget how our ancestors made sense of a world that gave them no answers. Only storms and silence and the terrible uncertainty of tomorrow, so let us remember. Enlil, Lord of the Storm, Mesopotamia. There was a time when the most powerful god in the world was not Zeus, not Odin, not Yahweh. It was Enlil. Ancient Sumer. In the cities of Ur and Nippur and Eridu, Enlil was the supreme deity. He was the god of wind, of breath, of the air that fills the space between earth and heaven. He commanded the storms. He decided the fates of kings. He held the tablet of destinies, upon which the order of the universe was written. To anger Enlil was to invite catastrophe, flood, famine, the collapse of empires. The Sumerians did not see him as benevolent. They saw him as necessary. He was order, yes, but he was also chaos. The storm that waters the fields and the storm that drowns the village. Both were Enlil. One of the oldest stories in human history tells of Enlil's wrath. He grew tired of humanity's noise, their endless clamor, and so he sent a flood to wipe them out. This story predates the biblical flood by more than 1,000 years. In the Sumerian version, a man named Zu-Sudra is warned by another god and survives by building a great boat. Enlil was not evil. He was inevitable. For nearly 2,000 years, he was worshipped across Mesopotamia. Kings claimed their authority from him. Priests sang his praises. Temples rose in his name, vast ziggurats reaching toward the sky where he dwelled. And then the world changed. Babylon rose, and with it, the god Marduk. Enlil's stories were retold with Marduk as the hero. His powers were transferred. His temples were repurposed. When the empires of Mesopotamia fell, when Sumer became Akkad, became Babylon, became Assyria, became Persian territory, Enlil faded. The cities that had worshipped him crumbled into dust. The language that praised him stopped being spoken. By the time of Alexander the Great, Enlil was already ancient history. Today, his name appears in textbooks and museums. Scholars study him, but no one prays to him. No one fears his storms. The wind still blows. But Enlil is gone. Tiamat, the primordial ocean, Mesopotamia. Before the world, there was water, not the water we know, clear, drinkable, contained in rivers and lakes. This was the water of chaos. Salt water. The deep. The void from which all things came. Her name was Tiamat. In Babylonian myth, Tiamat is the primordial goddess, the embodiment of the ocean. She is not a creator in the gentle sense. She is raw potential, unformed power. She exists before order, before separation, before the gods themselves. In the beginning, Tiamat and her consort Apsu, the freshwater god, mingled their waters. From their union came the first gods. But these younger gods were loud, chaotic, disrespectful. They disturbed the silence. Apsu wanted to destroy them. Tiamat, at first, resisted. But when the younger gods killed Apsu in self-defense, Tiamat's grief turned to rage. She became monstrous. She birthed an army of demons and dragons. She created the first scorpion men, the first serpent gods. She appointed Kingu, one of her children, as a champion and gave him the tablet of destinies. And then she went to war. The younger gods trembled. None could stand against her, until Marduk, the storm god of Babylon, stepped forward. He challenged Tiamat. He fought her in single combat. He caught her in a net of winds, shot an arrow into her mouth, split her body in two. From her corpse, he made the world. Her upper half became the sky. Her lower half became the earth. Her tears became the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Her ribs became the vault of heaven. This is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. It is a story of order triumphing over chaos, civilization defeating the wild, the new gods overcoming the old. But Tiamat was not always a monster. In earlier Sumerian traditions, She is simply the ocean. Necessary. Eternal. The source of all life. It was only later, when Babylon needed a story to justify its dominance, that she became the enemy, and so Tiamat, who was once the mother of gods, became the villain. Her name is symbol of everything that must be defeated for the world to exist. She has no temples, no prayers. She exists now only as a myth, a literary device, a name invoked in fantasy games and fiction, but once she was the deep. She was the water that covers the earth before land appears. She was the chaos from which all order is born, and perhaps she still is. Perhaps every time we look at the ocean and feel that ancient fear, that vertigo, that sense of standing before something vast and indifferent, we are looking at Tiamat. She was never truly defeated, only renamed. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, Mesopotamia, heaven had its gods. Earth had its gods, and beneath the earth, in the land of no return, there was Ereshkigal. She ruled the underworld. Not as a punishment, not as a devil, simply as the goddess of the place where all mortals eventually go. The Mesopotamians did not believe in heaven or hell as rewards or punishments. They believed that when you died, you went down into the dark, down into Akala, the house of dust, where the dead lived as shadows, eating clay and drinking stagnant water. And Ereshkigal was queen of that place. She did not choose this role. According to myth, she was taken there, abducted, trapped, and so she became the goddess of entrapment, of inevitability, of the door that only opens one way, the most famous. Story about her involves a sister, Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Inanna, radiant and ambitious, decided to visit the underworld, perhaps to conquer it, perhaps to witness it. The reasons are unclear, but she descended at each of the 7 gates. She was forced to remove a piece of her divine power, her crown, her jewelry, her robes, until she stood naked and powerless before her sister. Ereshkigal did not welcome her. She had Inanna killed and hung on a hook like meat. Only through trickery and the intervention of other gods was Inanna resurrected and allowed to return to the surface. But even then, a price had to be paid. Someone had to take her place. And so her consort, Dumuzi, was dragged down into the underworld in her stead. Ereshkigal is not cruel in this story. She is simply the rule, the boundary, the end. She appears in very few myths. She does not leave her realm. She does not interfere with the living. She simply waits, and yet she was worshipped. Not out of love, out of respect, out of the understanding that death comes for everyone, and it is better to acknowledge the goddess, who rules that domain than to pretend she does not exist. When Mesopotamian religion faded, Ereshkigal faded with it. The underworld she ruled was replaced by other underworlds, Hades, Sheol, Hell. The concept remained. The goddess did not. And no one speaks her name in prayer anymore, but the idea of her lingers. The queen in the dark, the sister who was cast down, the goddess who holds dominion over the one thing no one can escape. She is still there in every story about descent, every myth of the hero who goes below and returns changed. Ereshkigal was never defeated. She simply became unnecessary. The underworld is still there, but now it has no queen. Aten, the sun disk, Egypt. For a brief moment in history, Egypt had only one god. His name was Aten, the sun disk, the light itself. This was the vision of Pharaoh Akhenaten, one of the strangest rulers in Egyptian history. Around 1350 BCE, he declared that all the old gods, Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, the entire pantheon, were false, or at least unnecessary. There was only Aten, the sun, the source of all life. Akhenaten closed the temples of the other gods. He erased their names from monuments. He moved the capital of Egypt to a new city, Akhetaten, built in honor of Aten. He declared himself the sole intermediary between the god and the people. This was not a gentle reform. It was a revolution. For the priests of Amun, it was a catastrophe. For the common people, it was confusing. Egypt had worshipped many gods for thousands of years. The gods were woven into daily life, into death, into the rhythm of the Nile's floods and the harvest, but Akhenaten insisted. Aten was all. Aten was everything. The hymns to Aten are beautiful. They speak of the sun as a giver of life, a presence that touches all things equally. They describe the sun rising over the Nile, the cattle waking, the birds singing, the world coming alive under Aten's light. It sounds almost modern, almost monotheistic. Some scholars believe Akhenaten's religion influenced later monotheistic traditions, that the worship of Aten was a step toward the worship of Yahweh, of God singular and indivisible. But Aten's reign was short. When Akhenaten died, Egypt returned to the old gods with a fury. His successor, Tutankhamun, restored the temples. The priests of Amun reclaimed their power. Akhenaten was abandoned. Akhenaten's name was erased from king lists. He became the heretic pharaoh, the one who had tried to break Egypt and failed. And Aten, the god who was supposed to be eternal, disappeared not slowly, not over centuries. Within a generation, the temples were dismantled. The hymns were forgotten. The sun continued to rise, but it was no longer Aten. It was Ra again. It was the same light, but a different name, a different story. Aten's failure is instructive. Even a god imposed by a king, backed by the full power of the state, cannot survive if the people do not believe. The sun is still there, but Aten is not. Tyrannies, the Thunderer, Celtic. The Celts did not write their myths down. This is why so much of their religion is lost. We know their gods mostly through the accounts of Romans, who conquered them, and through scattered inscriptions, carvings, and place names. One name appears again and again. Tyrannies, the god of thunder, the wheel bearer, the one who rides the storm. The Romans compared him to Jupiter. The Gauls worshipped him across what is now France, Britain, and parts of Germany. His symbol was the wheel, perhaps representing the sun, or the turning of the seasons, or the wheel of fate. He was a god of power, of the sky splitting open, of the sound that makes you flinch even when you know it's coming. Some inscriptions suggest he was a god of war as well, that warriors called upon him before battle, asking for his strength, his fury. But we know very little for certain. We do not have his myths. We do not know his family, his enemies, his loves. We do not know if he was kind or cruel, if he answered prayers or ignored them. All we have is his name, carved into stone by people who are long dead. When the Romans conquered the Celtic lands, they brought their own gods. When Christianity spread, it absorbed what it could and buried the rest. Tyrannies became a footnote, a name in a list of forgotten gods, a symbol on a museum placard, but thunder still rolls across the hills of Britain and France. And somewhere in that sound, maybe, is an echo of the god who was once called by name, Dagon, god of grain, Levant. Dagon is remembered now, if at all, as a villain that in the Bible. He is the god of the Philistines, the enemy of the Israelites. When the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, they place it in the temple of Dagon. The next morning, the statue of Dagon has fallen on its face before the Ark. They set it upright. The next morning, it has fallen again, and this time its head and hands have broken off. The message is clear. Dagon is powerless before the God of Israel. But this was propaganda. Dagon was not a demon. He was not a god of war or chaos. He was a god of grain, of wheat and barley, of the harvest. His name comes from the word for grain in several Semitic languages. He was worshipped across the ancient Levant, by the Philistines, yes, but also by the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Amorites. He was a god of sustenance, of survival, of the bread that kept people alive. In Ugaritic texts, Dagon is the father of Baal, the storm god. He is an elder deity, respected, foundational. Not a warrior, but a provider. When the Israelites rose to power, they brought their own god with them. And in their telling of history, the gods of their enemies had to be diminished. Dagon's temples were destroyed. His worship was forbidden. His name became synonymous with false idols, and so Dagon, who once fed nations, became a cautionary tale. Today, he exists mostly in popular culture, often misrepresented as a fish god, a confusion that arose from a mistaken etymology. He appears in horror fiction, in video games, in stories about ancient evil. But he was never evil. He was grain. He was bread. He was the thing that allowed civilizations to grow, and when his people were conquered, he was forgotten. The fields still grow wheat. But Dagon is gone, Mot, god of death, Ugarit. Death, in the ancient city of Ugarit, had a name, Mot. He was not a comforting god. He was not a guide to the afterlife, or a judge of souls, or a figure of mercy. He was death itself. Hunger, the dry season, the end of all living things. The Baal cycle, one of the few surviving Canaanite myths. Mot is the great enemy of Baal, the storm god who brings rain and fertility. Each year, Baal descends into the underworld, swallowed by Mot. And each year, the rains stop. The land dries. The crops fail. Baal's sister, Anat, rages. She storms into the underworld, confronts Mot, and kills him, cutting him to pieces, scattering him across the fields like grain. And with Mot's death, Baal returns. The rains come back. The world is green again, but Mot does not stay dead. He cannot. Death cannot be killed. The next year, he returns. And the cycle begins again. This is the rhythm of the seasons. Life and death, locked in eternal combat. Neither can win. Both are necessary. Mot was not worshipped the way Baal was. You do not pray to death for favors. You do not build temples to inevitability, but he was acknowledged, respected, feared. When Ugarit was destroyed around 1200 BCE, during the Bronze Age collapse, Mot's myths were buried with it. The city was never rebuilt. The language was lost. For thousands of years, no one knew his name. It was only in the 20th century, when archaeologists unearthed clay tablets from the ruins of Ugarit, that Mot was rediscovered. His stories were read again. His name was spoken, but he is not worshipped. He is studied, analyzed. Compared to other death gods from other cultures, death is still here. But Mot is not. He has become what he always was, a name for something that cannot be named, cannot be fought, cannot be escaped. Only now, we no longer call him by his name. Tangaroa, Lord of the Ocean, Polynesia. In the beginning, there was darkness, and in the darkness, the sky and the earth were pressed together, and between them, the gods were trapped. This is the story told across Polynesia, from New Zealand to Hawaii to Tahiti. The details change, but the shape remains. The gods, children of the Sky Father and Earth Mother, conspired to separate their parents, to create space, to let in light. Tangaroa, the god of the sea, was one of those gods. In some traditions, he is calm and generous. In others, he is jealous and vengeful. But in all traditions, he is the ocean, not the god of the ocean. He is the ocean. When you sail across the Pacific, when you navigate by stars and currents and the flight of birds, you are moving through Tangaroa's body. He can cradle you, or he can swallow you. For the Polynesians, who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in wooden canoes, Tangaroa was not abstract. He was immediate. Survival depended on understanding him, respecting him, appeasing him. When Europeans arrived, they brought new gods. Christianity spread across the islands. Missionaries discouraged the old ways, the old prayers, the old stories. Tangaroa did not vanish all at once. In some places, he merged with Christian figures. In others, he was quietly set aside, his stories told only in private, only to children, only as legends. Today, he is remembered. There has been a revival of Polynesian culture, a reclaiming of old stories, old names. But he is not worshipped the way he once was, not with the urgency of sailors who knew their lives depended on his favor. The ocean is still there, vast, indifferent, powerful, but it has no name now. Or rather, it has many names, none of them gods. Tangaroa has become a symbol, a character in stories, a name on a map. The water remains. The god does not. Shared patterns among forgotten gods. When we look across cultures, across continents, across the span of human history, certain patterns emerge. The gods we have forgotten share common traits, common fates. Most ruled nature, not morality. Enlil did not care if you were virtuous. He cared if you honored him. Tiamat was not interested in your ethics. She was the ocean. Tangaroa did not judge your soul. He judged whether you respected the sea. These gods were not concerned with how you treated your neighbor. They were concerned with whether you performed the rituals correctly, whether you made the proper offerings, whether you acknowledged their power. This is different from the gods that replace them. The Abrahamic God cares deeply about morality. So does the Buddha's enlightenment. So do the ethical systems that have shaped modern religion. But the old gods were not moral. They were elemental. They were the world itself, indifferent to human concepts of good and evil. Most were replaced, not defeated. Tiamat was killed in myth, but in reality, she was simply forgotten. Enlil was not struck down by a rival god. He was eclipsed by changing empires and shifting languages. Dagon's temples were destroyed. Yes, but he was not destroyed. He was simply no longer needed. The people who worshipped him were conquered, absorbed, converted, and their god went with them. This is how gods die. Not in battle, but in silence. Names disappeared before beliefs. Often, the function of a god survives even when the god does not. People still pray for rain. They still fear the ocean. They still mark the seasons, honor the harvest, mourn the dead, but they do this without naming Enlil, without invoking Tangaroa, without acknowledging Ereshkigal. The god becomes a metaphor, a story, a symbol in a comparative mythology textbook. The belief remains, but the name is gone. Humans always create gods in their image, then outgrow them. The gods we have discussed were products of their time. Enlil made sense in a world where storms were incomprehensible forces. Mot made sense in a world where the dry season could mean death. Dagon made sense in an agricultural society where grain was survival. But as the world changed, the gods stopped fitting. When we learned what causes storms, Enlil's power diminished. When we built irrigation systems and stored grain, Dagon became less essential. When we mapped the ocean and understood currents, Tangaroa became navigable. The gods did not change. The world did, and so we stopped needing them. This is not unique to ancient gods. It is a pattern that continues. Every generation creates the gods it needs, and every generation discards the gods it no longer understands. That we are not more rational than our ancestors. We are not wiser. That we simply have different needs, different fears, different explanations for the world, and so we have different gods. Or perhaps no gods at all. Perhaps we have replaced the divine with other systems, science, ideology, technology, but the impulse remains. The need to name the forces beyond our control, to give them shape, to speak to them, to believe they might listen. The names change. The need does not. The gods we have remembered tonight are silent now. Their temples are ruins. Their hymns are translated by scholars who do not believe in them. Their names are entries in encyclopedias, subjects of study, not objects of worship. And yet, they were real in the way that matters. Real to the people who prayed to them. Real in the lives they shaped, the fears they soothed, the meaning they provided. To dismiss them as just myths is to misunderstand what myths are. Myths are not lies. They are the stories we tell to survive, the frameworks we build to hold chaos at bay, and gods are the names we give to the things we cannot control. For thousands of years, humans have looked at the storm and said, there is a god in that. They have looked at the ocean and said, "There is a God in that." They have looked at death, at birth, at the turning of the seasons, and said, "There is a God in that." And they were not wrong, not because the gods were literally real, but because the impulse to see the divine in the world is itself real. Deities is human, we are meaning-making creatures. We cannot live in a world that is only atoms and void. We need stories. We need names. We need to believe that the universe is not indifferent, or at least, that we can speak to it. The gods we have forgotten gave our ancestors that. They gave them a way to speak to the storm, a way to honor the ocean, a way to face death and still wake up the next morning and plant the fields. And when those gods were no longer needed, when the world changed and new stories took their place, they faded, but they were not wasted. Every prayer spoken to Enlil was real to the person who spoke it. Every offering made to Tangaroa was an act of hope. Every invocation of Ereshkigal was an acknowledgement of mortality, of the thing we all must face. These gods served their purpose. They held the world together for the people who needed them, and then, time moved on. This will happen to all gods. Eventually, the gods we worship now, the beliefs we hold sacred, the truths we think are eternal, they, too, will fade, not because they are false, but because the world will change in ways we cannot predict. And future generations will need different names, different stories, different gods. This is not a tragedy. It is simply the way of things. We build. We believe. We pass it on, and then it transforms into something else. The question is not whether our gods will be forgotten. The question is, what will we do with the time we have? What meaning will we make? What will we name? What will we honor while we are here? The gods we have remembered tonight are gone, but the impulse that created them, the need to find the sacred in the world, to speak to the forces beyond ourselves, to say, there is something greater here, that impulse is still alive. It is in every act of wonder, every moment of awe, every time we stand before the ocean, or the storm, or the night sky, and feel something vast and nameless stir inside us. We may not call it a god, but it is the same feeling, the same recognition that we are small and the world is large. And there is mystery here. The names change, the mystery remains. Rest now. Let the old gods sleep. They have earned it, and when you wake, the world will still be here, full of forces we cannot name, waiting for us to speak to them, waiting for us to make them sacred again.